We've all heard the stories of humanity stepping out into the stars, bringing their wars, their loud music, and their relentless drive. But we forget how weirdly, terrifyingly gentle they can be. What happens when a species built entirely for violence, feared by the entire quadrant, encounters a human mechanic with grease on his hands and zero sense of self-preservation? When a soft, fragile human looks at a walking tank and sees something no one else does? The reaction isn't romance. It's shock. The lower engineering deck of the orbital trawler Wayfarer smelled like stale copper, burnt ozone, and the sour tang of unwashed bodies. It was a miserable place to earn a living, suspended in the cold vacuum above a mining colony that hadn't seen a profitable quarter in a decade. For Nadine, the misery was comfortable. It was predictable. She wasn't born with the name Nadine. She had bought it off a dead freighter pilot 3 sectors back, along with the forged transit papers that allowed her to walk among the softer species without immediately triggering a planetary lockdown. Her actual species designation was a series of guttural clicks and deep chest-rattling hums that most translators rendered simply as hazard. She was an apex predator, engineered for a war that had ended before she was born. Her body was a testament to violence. Dense ash-gray chitin plated her from the crest of her elongated skull to the digitigrade joints of her legs. She stood a full head taller than the largest man on the crew, her shoulders broad and heavily armored. Beneath the plating, dense muscle fibers coiled like high-tension wires. She didn't have a soft, expressive human face. She had sharp, angular ridges, deep-set, pitch-black eyes, and mandibles that tucked neatly flush against her jawline when she wasn't agitated. She was, by every galactic standard, a monster. She knew it. The way the crew looked at her, eyes darting to the deck plates, shoulders tensing as they squeezed past her in the corridors, was a constant, silent confirmation. Except for Cole. "Pass the 9mm wrench, would you?" Cole's voice drifted out from beneath the massive, leaking primary coolant housing. Nadine stood over him, holding a mag torch in one hand and a bundle of fibrous sealant in the other. She looked down. Cole's legs stuck out from under the machinery. He was wearing faded denim coveralls, stained black at the knees. He tapped a greasy boot impatiently against the grated floor. She knelt, her heavily armored knee clanking against the steel deck, and reached into the toolbox. Her hand, 4 thick, multi-jointed digits, tipped with dull claws, dwarfed the small metal tool. She slid it across the deck to him. "Thanks," Cole grunted. A second later, the screech of metal on metal echoed through the tight space. "Damn it, stripped. Mother of all things holy, who tightened this?" "Marshall," Nadine said. Her voice was a resonant, synthesized bass that vibrated in her chest cavity. It always sounded a little too loud, a little too harsh for casual conversation. "Right, Marshall. Remind me to put a snake in his bunk." Cole slid out from under the housing, wiping a streak of black grease across his forehead with the back of a bare, fragile hand. He was so deeply, inexplicably soft. Nadine watched him sit up. Humans were a walking contradiction. They were water balloons stretched over brittle calcium, lacking natural armor, venom, or any sensible survival adaptations. Yet, they thrived in the worst corners of the galaxy. Cole was a prime example. He was missing half his left ear from a bar fight on a station a month ago. His knuckles were permanently scarred from slipped wrenches, and he currently had a dark purple bruise blooming along his jawline from a loose cargo strap. He was constantly breaking, yet he never stopped moving. He looked up at her, squinting against the harsh glare of the overhead halogens. He didn't flinch. He didn't drop his gaze to her boots. He just looked at her, his hazel eyes locking onto her flat, unreadable black ones. "You're staring, big girl," Cole said, a lazy, lopsided smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. Nadine shifted her weight. Her neck plates scraped against each other, a dry, rhythmic sound like stones grinding together. "You are bleeding," she noted flatly. Cole looked down at his forearm. A thin red line was weeping blood where a jagged piece of the housing had caught him. He sighed, uncaring. "Add it to the collection." He grabbed a filthy rag from his back pocket and tied it tightly around the cut, using his teeth to pull the knot taut. Nadine felt a strange, uncomfortable tightness in her upper chest. It was a biological misfire. Her instincts were wired to see weakness and exploit it, to view a bleeding creature as either prey or a liability. But watching Cole casually bandage himself with a rag that probably contained 3 different strains of industrial bacteria didn't trigger her predatory drive. It just made her deeply, inexplicably tired. "You will get an infection," she stated. "I've got an immune system built on cheap whiskey and bad decisions, Nadine. I'll be fine." He grabbed the mag torch from her hand. His skin brushed lightly against her thick, ridged knuckles. He didn't pull away. He didn't shiver in disgust at the cold, hard texture of her exoskeleton. He just took the tool and smiled. "Let's crack this thing open." Nadine stood, towering over him, the hum of the ship vibrating through the soles of her feet. She hated the way he smiled at her. It felt like a trap she didn't know how to disarm. An hour later, the coolant housing decided it had enough. They were deep inside the access crawl space, a narrow metal throat that barely accommodated Nadine's bulk. The air was suffocatingly hot, thick with the smell of vaporized antifreeze and Cole's sweat. The emergency strobes bathed the tight quarters in a sickly, pulsating amber light. Nadine was bracing the main pressure valve with both hands, her boots locked into the deck, grating to keep from sliding. Cole was beside her, wedged between a bundle of fiber optic cables and the scalding hot primary pipe, trying to bypass the manual override. "Hold it steady," Cole shouted over the deafening hiss of escaping gas. "I am holding it," Nadine rumbled, her voice vibrating the metal walls around them. Her artificial muscles strained against her carapace. The pressure was immense, far beyond what any human or standard worker drone could handle. Her joints whined in protest, a high-pitched mechanical sound. "Almost got it. Just need to..." Cole grunted, his face pale and slick with sweat. He reached across the piping, his arm fully extended. That was when the secondary seal blew. It wasn't an explosion, but a catastrophic failure of a pressurized joint. A high-pressure jet of superheated coolant vapor erupted from the pipe directly beside Cole's head. Before the human could even register the sound, Nadine moved. Her biology was designed to react in fractions of a millisecond. Before Cole could scream, before he could raise his hands, Nadine lunged. She threw her massive armored body across the gap, slamming Cole into the bulkhead and pinning him there, turning her broad, chitinous back to the geyser of scalding steam. The steam hit her carapace with the force of a physical blow. It hissed and shrieked against her armor. The heat was intense, even for her, baking the outer layers of her exoskeleton, turning the ash-gray plates a dull, scorched black. She dug her claws into the metal wall on either side of Cole's head, forming a living, impenetrable shield over him. Beneath her, Cole was frozen. Nadine braced herself, expecting the inevitable reaction. She was crushing him. Her sheer mass, the terrifying speed of her movement, the jagged edges of her chest plates pressing into his fragile ribs. She knew what this looked like. She knew what it felt like, to be pinned by a monster in the dark. She waited for him to thrash, to panic, to punch at her in blind, terrified self-preservation. Instead, she felt his hands. They didn't strike her. They gripped her sides. His fingers curled around the sharp edges of her lateral plating, not pushing her away, but holding on. The automated safety protocols finally kicked in. The deafening roar of the vent cut off with a heavy mechanical thud, leaving only the sound of emergency fans spinning up and the heavy, ragged sound of Cole's breathing. Nadine didn't move immediately. Her back was smoking, the foul smell of burnt chemical residue hanging thick in the cramped air. Slowly, mechanically, she pushed herself back, unlocking her claws from the bulkhead. She looked down at him. The amber light caught the pale terror in his eyes, the heavy sweat on his brow. "Are you—" Cole choked on a breath, coughing violently as he inhaled the residual fumes. "Are you okay?" Nadine froze. The question didn't compute. She ran a quick internal diagnostic. Surface temperatures were elevated, minor superficial scorching on her dorsal plates. No structural damage. "I am unharmed," she said, her voice dropping an octave, slipping into the harsh, clicking cadence of her native tongue before she forced the human words out. "You are the one who lacks thermal shielding. Did you sustain burns?" Cole let his head fall back against the metal wall, laughing. It was a weak, breathless sound that sounded entirely inappropriate for the situation. "Did I—" "Nadine, you just took a point-blank blast of 300-degree steam to the spine, and you're asking about my baby-soft skin?" "You are fragile," she stated plainly, stating a biological fact. Cole shook his head, wiping a hand down his face. "Jesus, remind me to buy you a drink when we hit the station." He pushed himself up, wincing slightly as his bruised back scraped the wall. He reached out and lightly tapped the center of her chest plate. "Thanks, big guy. Seriously." She looked at his hand, resting against her armor. The contrast was jarring. His skin was pale, smeared with dirt and grease, veins visible beneath the surface. Her chest was a solid block of dark, unyielding armor, built to deflect shrapnel. She stepped back abruptly, the sudden movement causing Cole's hand to drop. "The valve is sealed," she said, turning her back to him, ignoring the residual heat radiating from her own shell. "We should return to the upper decks." She didn't wait for him to respond. She practically crawled out of the access tunnel, her mind a mess of conflicting, chaotic static. He shouldn't have asked if she was okay. He shouldn't have laughed. He shouldn't have touched her without flinching. They ended up in the auxiliary mess hall, a cramped, dimly lit room that smelled permanently of synthetic protein and old coffee. The main lights were still down while the ship's systems rebooted from the power surge, leaving only the soft blue glow of the backup strips along the floorboards. Nadine sat on a reinforced cargo crate in the corner, a massive shadow against the bulkhead. She was agitated. Her mandibles, usually tucked away, were clicking in a restless, irregular rhythm. She kept rubbing a rough rag over her scorched shoulder plates, trying to wipe away the chemical stain, though it was baked into the chitin. Cole sat across from her, on a standard-issue stool that looked dangerously close to buckling under his weight. He had a first aid kit open on his lap. The steam hadn't hit him, but the violent shove against the bulkhead had opened a cut above his eyebrow, and his knuckles were scraped raw. He was dabbing antiseptic onto his forehead, hissing quietly through his teeth. "You are applying it incorrectly," Nadine said. The silence had stretched too long, and her agitation needed an outlet. "You are smearing the dirt into the laceration. You will cause sepsis." Cole paused, the little plastic swab hovering near his face. He looked at her, entirely unbothered by her harsh tone. He held the swab out toward her. "Be my guest, Doc." Nadine stared at the tiny piece of plastic. Then she looked at his face. He wasn't mocking her. He was genuinely offering it. Slowly, she stood up. She crossed the small room, her heavy footfalls making the deck vibrate. She stopped in front of him, towering over his seated form. She took the tiny swab between her massive, clawed forefinger and thumb. It looked absurd. A surgical instrument held by a wrecking ball. "Stay still," she ordered. Cole leaned back slightly, tilting his head up to give her access. He closed his eyes. Nadine hesitated. She leaned in. Up close, the fragility of his face was overwhelming. She could see the faint pulse beating at his temple. She could feel the heat radiating off his skin. With excruciating care, she pressed the swab against the cut. Cole didn't flinch. His breathing remained slow, even. He trusted her. He was sitting in a dark room with a creature that could snap his neck with a twitch of her wrist, and he had his eyes closed. "You are an idiot," she mumbled softly, the sub-vocal hum vibrating in her chest. "I've been told," Cole murmured, keeping his eyes shut. "But I'm alive, mostly thanks to you." Nadine finished cleaning the cut and applied a small dermal patch over it. She pulled her hand back, intending to step away, to retreat to her dark corner. But Cole opened his eyes. He didn't look away. He looked right up at her face. Not at the massive shoulders, not at the deadly claws, but at her face. The harsh blue lighting caught the jagged, asymmetrical ridges of her cheekbones, the thick, armored plating that shielded her eyes. It was a face meant to evoke terror. It was a face designed for war. Cole raised his hand. Nadine froze. Every instinct told her to snap her jaws shut, to step back, to prepare for a strike. But she couldn't move. Cole's bare fingers brushed against the thick, dark plating of her cheek. His touch was incredibly light, tracing the edge of a deep, jagged scar she had acquired years ago from a plasma burn. His skin was warm. "You always hide in the corners, Nadine," Cole said quietly, his voice lacking its usual, sarcastic edge. It was grounded, heavy. She swallowed, her throat clicking dryly. "I am large. I require space. You hide," he corrected gently. His thumb dragged lightly over the edge of her lower mandible. He was looking at her with a profound, terrifying focus. "You think everyone looks at you and sees a monster." "I am a hazard," she stated, her voice trembling slightly, a rare break in her synthesized bass. "That is what I am. It is not an opinion. It is a biological reality." Cole let his hand rest against her face, the soft flesh of his palm against the cold, unyielding armor of her jaw. "You're beautiful." He whispered it. It wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. It was spoken with the casual, absolute certainty of a man observing a sunrise. Nadine stopped breathing. Her internal system spiked. Adrenaline, or her species' highly caustic equivalent, flooded her veins. Her pupils dilated until her eyes were solid pools of black void. Beautiful. The word was a foreign object, a piece of shrapnel tearing into her mind. She didn't have a frame of reference for it. Soft things were beautiful, fragile things, sunsets on atmospheric worlds, glass sculptures, human women with symmetrical faces and smooth skin. She was ash and armor. She was sharp edges and crushing force. A sudden, violent surge of anger rose in her chest. It felt like a cruel joke. It felt like he was mocking the very core of her existence, treating her like a pet, pitying her. She jerked her head back, breaking the contact with his hand so fast it made a sharp crack in the quiet room. Her mandibles flared open, a deeply aggressive posture, clicking furiously. "Do not!" she snarled, her voice dropping into a guttural, terrifying register that made the steel bulkheads vibrate. "Do not mock me, human!" Cole didn't recoil. His hand dropped to his lap, but he didn't pull away in fear. His hazel eyes widened slightly at her sudden aggression, but the underlying emotion didn't change. He looked confused, but not afraid. "I'm not mocking you," he said, his voice steady. Nadine's chest heaved. Her fists clenched, the claws digging painfully into her own thick palms. She searched his face for the lie. She looked for the smirk, the pity, the fear. There was nothing but an exhausted, painfully honest mechanic staring back at her. The anger evaporated, leaving behind a cold, hollow terror that she had never experienced in any war zone. She didn't know how to fight this. She didn't know how to armor herself against a whispered word. Her mandibles clicked shut. She took a step back, her massive frame trembling ever so slightly. "I need," Nadine choked on the words, her vocal synthesizer struggling to process the chaotic signals from her brain. "I need to check the primary couplings." Before Cole could say another word, she turned and fled the room, the heavy, panicked thud of her boots echoing down the dark corridor, leaving the human sitting alone in the blue light. The heavy pneumatic press in the fabrication bay slammed down with a force that rattled Nadine's teeth. Crunch. A thick slab of warped hull plating flattened into a jagged, uneven sheet. The noise was deafening, a brutal mechanical percussion that drowned out the ever-present hum of the Wayfarer's engines. Nadine hit the release lever with the heel of her hand. She dragged the heavy slab out, her claws screeching against the steel, and tossed it onto the scrap pile. It landed with a hollow, echoing clang. She grabbed another warped piece, shoved it under the press, and hit the hydraulic trigger again. Crunch. She needed the noise. She needed the brain-rattling vibration, the smell of hot hydraulic fluid, the stinging scent of atomized rust in the air. For the past 72 hours, ever since she fled the auxiliary mess hall, her mind had been a looping, chaotic playback of a single, impossibly quiet moment. "You're beautiful." She hit the press again. The metal shrieked. It was a malfunction. That was the only logical conclusion. Humans were prone to delirium when subjected to high-stress environments. The heat, the near miss with the steam vent, the adrenaline dump, it had caused a synaptic misfire in Cole's fragile brain. He didn't mean it. He couldn't have meant it. The heavy bay doors hissed open behind her. Nadine froze, her hand hovering over the release lever. Her internal thermal sensors picked up a body signature. Small, low core temperature compared to her own. She turned, her mandibles instinctively flaring into a defensive posture. It wasn't Cole. It was Garrett, one of the junior avionics techs. He was a skinny, pale human who always smelled faintly of stale nicotine and fear. He stopped dead in his tracks the moment Nadine turned to face him. His eyes darted to her open mandibles, then quickly dropped to the floor grates. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. Chief wants the fab bay locked down for the shift rotation, Garrett mumbled to his boots, his voice tight. He was physically leaning backward, angling his body toward the open door, desperate to run. This was the reaction she knew. This was the established order of the universe. She was a hazard. He was soft tissue. He should be afraid. Normally, she ignored it. Sometimes she even found a grim, isolating comfort in it. It meant no one would bother her. But today, staring at Garrett's trembling shoulders and averted eyes, Nadine felt a sudden, sickening wave of revulsion. Not toward the human, but toward the entire, predictable charade. It felt hollow. Cole had ruined it. Understood, Nadine barked, her voice synthesizer crackling with unnecessary volume. Garrett flinched as if she had struck him. He nodded once, a jerky, panicked motion, and practically scrambled back out into the corridor, hitting the door release with a sweaty palm. Nadine watched the heavy blast doors slide shut. She exhaled, a long, rattling hiss that vented heat from her lateral gills. She reached up and rubbed her face, her thick claws scraping against the carbon-scored plating of her cheek. The exact spot Cole had touched. She flinched and dropped her hand. She spent the next 3 shifts living in the maintenance crawl spaces. She ate raw, iron-heavy nutrient paste squeezed from foil packets, the taste like chalk and pennies on her tongue. She slept in 2-hour cycles, wedged between a humming capacitor bank and a cold water main. She was avoiding him, and she hated herself for it. She was an apex predator, hiding in the walls from a mechanic with a bruised jaw. It couldn't last. Space aboard a trawler was finite. On the 4th day, the Wayfarer dropped out of standard transit to navigate a dense asteroid field. The ship shuddered violently, the structural groans echoing through the lower decks. Nadine was in the port-side manifold chamber, re-torquing the heavy suspension struts. The hatch above her unsealed with a sharp hiss. Nadine didn't look up. She kept her wrench locked on the massive bolt, applying 300 pounds of torque with a smooth mechanical pull of her shoulders. A pair of greasy steel-toed boots descended the rungs, followed by denim coveralls and a faded gray t-shirt. Cole dropped the last 2 feet, landing lightly on the grated floor. He wiped his hands on a filthy rag, tucking it into his back pocket. He looked exactly the same. The cut above his eye was healing into a dark, angry scab, and the bruise on his jaw had faded to a sickly yellow. Nadine's chest tightened. Her breath hitched, catching in the labyrinth of her secondary lungs. She focused intensely on the bolt, refusing to turn around. "Strut 4 is over-torqued," Cole said. His voice was casual, flat, just the usual mid-shift grumble of a tired engineer. Nadine paused. She checked the pressure gauge on her wrist display. He was right. She had been pulling too hard. "Adjusting," she muttered, her synthesized voice devoid of inflection. She reversed the wrench and eased the pressure back. Cole walked over and leaned against the bulkhead beside her. He was close enough that she could smell him over the heavy scent of engine grease, sweat, cheap synthetic coffee, and the sharp tang of ozone. He didn't mention the mess hall. He didn't ask why she had been avoiding the common areas. He simply pulled a crumpled, oil-stained schematic from his pocket and smoothed it out against his thigh. Finch blew the primary relay in the atmospheric scrubber on deck 4, Cole said, tapping a blunt fingernail against the paper. Idiot tried to hotwire the bypass. Now half the deck is breathing recycled exhaust. We need to rip out the main housing and manually patch the filtration matrix. Nadine slowly turned her head. She looked at the schematic, then up at his face. He was looking at the paper, his brow furrowed in concentration. There was no awkwardness in his posture, no pity, no mocking smirk. He was just a mechanic dealing with a broken ship. The housing is cast iron, Nadine said slowly, testing the waters. It weighs 400 standard pounds. Cole looked up, meeting her pitch-black eyes. He offered a small, lopsided smile. Yeah, that's why I need the big girl. You lift it, I patch it, like always. Like always. The words settled over her like a heavy, protective blanket. He was offering her an out, a return to the baseline. He wasn't demanding an emotional reckoning. He was demanding her strength, her utility, her purpose. Nadine's mandibles clicked once, a soft, involuntary sound of relief. She unclipped the massive wrench from the bolt and magnetically locked it to her thigh. "Lead the way," she said. Cole nodded, turning toward the hatch. As he started to climb, he glanced back down over his shoulder. "Good to see you, Nadine. Crawl spaces were getting lonely without my shadow." He disappeared up the ladder. Nadine stood in the dim light of the manifold chamber for a long moment, the heavy vibration of the engines thrumming through her boots. She felt off balance, a bizarre mixture of profound relief and an undeniable, terrifying spark of warmth. Deck 4 was a disaster. The air was thick and hazy, carrying the acrid, burning smell of melted insulation and recycled carbon. The emergency lighting bathed the tight corridor in a sickly, pulsating red glow. It was suffocatingly hot. Nadine and Cole stood before the atmospheric scrubber, a massive cylindrical beast of machinery wedged into an alcove that was built for a machine half its size. To get to the blown relay, they had to remove the outer casing. "All right," Cole said, his voice muffled by the heavy respirator mask strapped over his face. He checked the seal around his jaw. "Atmosphere in here is toxic for me. Keep an eye on my vitals monitor on my suit. If the light goes red, drag me out by my ankles." Nadine didn't need a respirator. Her biology could filter far worse than burning plastic. She looked down at him, her heavy brow ridges pulling together. "That is an inefficient retrieval method. You would suffer blunt force trauma to the cranium." Cole laughed, the sound hollow and metallic through the mask. "Just get me out, Nadine. Don't worry about my head. Not much up there anyway." He stepped back, gesturing to the iron casing. "All yours." Nadine stepped forward. She planted her digitigrade legs wide, gripping the grated floor with her heavy boots. She wedged her thick, armored fingers into the narrow seam of the casing. The metal was scalding hot, but her chitin barely registered it. She braced her core, the dense muscle fibers beneath her armor coiling tight. She pulled. The metal groaned. A horrific, high-pitched screech of tearing steel echoed down the corridor. Sparks showered the deck as the oxidized locking pins gave way. With a final, brutal heave, Nadine ripped the 400-pound iron casing free. She took 2 steps back and dropped it. The deck plates shuddered violently under the impact. Cole let out a low whistle over the comms. "Damn, remind me never to owe you money." He moved into the alcove, sliding into the narrow gap between the exposed filtration matrix and the bulkhead. It was a terrifyingly tight fit. If the ship rolled, or if the internal gyros failed, the shifting machinery would crush him instantly. Nadine stood right behind him, her massive hands hovering near the gap, ready to catch the internal frame if it slipped. For 20 minutes, the only sounds were the hiss of Cole's respirator, the scrape of his tools, and the heavy, rhythmic thud of Nadine's dual heartbeats. She watched him work. His hands were quick, precise, navigating the mess of melted wires and blackened circuit boards with practiced ease. He was so small in the dark, red-lit alcove, so fragile. One mistake with the live power feed, one slip of the heavy internal baffles, and he would be dead. Yet, he didn't shake. He didn't hesitate. "You are not afraid," Nadine said. The words slipped out before she could stop them. Her synthesized voice boomed in the tight space. Cole paused. He didn't turn around, his hand still holding a pair of wire strippers. "Of the voltage?" "Of everything," she clarified. Her mandibles clicked nervously. "You are surrounded by lethal hazards, the machinery, the vacuum outside the hull. Me. You possess no natural defenses. You should be in a constant state of terror." Cole went back to stripping the wire. "Fear is exhausting, Nadine. Takes too much calories. Besides, I have defenses." "Name one." "I'm stubborn," he said, twisting a copper wire into place. "And I know how to fix things." "That does not deflect shrapnel." Cole sighed. He dropped his hands and finally turned his head, looking up at her over his shoulder. The red emergency light caught the reflection in the glass of his respirator. "You're still thinking about what I said," Cole stated softly over the comms. It wasn't a question. Nadine's armor felt suddenly too tight. The ambient heat in the corridor seemed to spike. She shifted her weight, the metal joints of her legs whining softly. "I do not understand it. It is biologically illogical. I am a machine of war. I am covered in ash and bone. I am not aesthetically pleasing." Cole turned completely around, wedging himself awkwardly against the hot machinery so he could face her. He pulled the respirator mask down off his face, letting it hang around his neck. "Put that back on," Nadine snapped immediately, stepping forward. "The particulates—" "I've got 2 minutes before my lungs complain," Cole interrupted, coughing slightly as he breathed in the acrid air. He looked up at her, his hazel eyes locking onto her black, unreadable stare. "You're thinking like a human from a holo vid, Nadine. You think beauty is symmetry, soft skin, pretty dresses. That is the universal standard for your species. That is the standard for rich people living on core worlds who have never had to patch a hull breach with duct tape," Cole countered, his voice rough. He leaned his head back against the bulkhead, looking at her massive armored form. "I grew up on a salvage yard on Titan," Cole said quietly. "Everything there was broken. Everything was rusting. You know what my old man taught me?" He pointed to an old, heavily armored, deep-core mining rig. It was ugly, covered in scorch marks, dented, asymmetrical, built like a brick. He told me, "Cole, look at that machine. It survived 50 years in the crushing dark. It protected its crew. It did its job." Cole raised his hand, pointing a grease-stained finger directly at her chest plate. "My dad called that rig beautiful," Cole said. "Because it survived. Because it was strong enough to keep the soft things inside it alive." Nadine stopped breathing. The chaotic static in her mind, the noise that had been deafening her for 4 days, suddenly ceased. The silence that replaced it was profound. "You see a monster in the mirror," Cole said, his voice dropping to a harsh, raw whisper. "I see a woman who took a blast of superheated steam to the spine so I wouldn't cook. I see armor that holds the line. I see someone who survives, no matter how brutal the universe gets." He reached out. This time, he didn't touch her face. He wrapped his bare, fragile fingers around the thick, ash-gray plating of her forearm. "Function is beautiful, Nadine," he said, coughing again as the toxic air hit the back of his throat. "Resilience is beautiful. You are exactly what you need to be. And that is beautiful." Nadine stared down at his hand, gripping her arm. The heat from his skin seeped through the thick layers of her exoskeleton. It wasn't a fire. It wasn't the searing heat of a plasma burn or a steam vent. It was a steady, grounding warmth. She didn't pull away. For the first time in her life, the crushing weight of her own existence felt lighter. He hadn't stripped away her identity. He hadn't tried to pretend she wasn't a terrifying apex predator. He had taken her armor, her violence, her harsh edges, and he had reframed them. He didn't love her despite the monster she was. He revered the monster for keeping them alive. "Your respiratory system is failing," Nadine noted quietly, her synthesized voice completely stripped of its usual harshness. It came out as a deep, resonant hum. Cole coughed violently, his chest heaving. He offered a weak, lopsided smile. "Yeah, probably." Nadine reached forward. Her massive clawed hand moved with excruciating gentleness. She hooked one thick digit under the strap of his respirator and pulled it back up, securing it firmly over his nose and mouth. She checked the seal, her thumb brushing lightly against his cheek. "Fix the relay, Cole," she said softly. Cole tapped the side of his mask in acknowledgement. He turned back to the machinery, his shoulders relaxing. Nadine stood behind him in the red dark. She squared her massive shoulders, planting her boots firmly on the deck. She watched the human work, feeling the heavy, rhythmic thud of her own dual hearts, no longer trying to hide the sound. The main mess hall during the mid-cycle shift change was a masterclass in sensory overload. It smelled intensely of reheated synthetic proteins, stale sweat, and the sharp, chemical tang of industrial floor cleaner. 30 crew members were crammed into a space designed for 20, their voices a dull, overlapping roar over the ever-present thrum of the ship's engines. Nadine stood outside the pressure doors. Usually, this was the point where she would turn left. She would head down to the maintenance corridors, rip open a foil packet of iron paste, and eat in the comforting dark of the vibrating bulkheads. She was too big for the benches. Her elbows encroached on others' space. Her eating habits, which involved unhinging her lower mandibles to swallow large, unchewed chunks of matter, tended to make the softer species lose their appetites. She lifted her hand and pressed the door release. The heavy doors hissed apart. The dull roar of the room spilled out into the corridor. Nadine stepped over the threshold, her heavy digitigrade boots striking the deck plates with a solid, undeniable thud. The noise in the room didn't stop completely, but it dipped. It was a localized quiet, a ripple of tension that spread outward from where she stood. Eyes darted toward her, then quickly down to aluminum trays. Shoulders hunched. Conversations turned into strained murmurs. Nadine felt the familiar urge to retreat, to shrink her massive shoulders inward and apologize for her own terrifying biology. but she felt the ghost of a warm, grease-stained hand gripping her armored forearm. "Function is beautiful. You are exactly what you need to be." She didn't shrink. She straightened her spine, her cervical plates locking together with a dry, stony rasp. She walked toward the food dispensers. She ignored the wide eyes of the quartermaster as she punched in her dietary code. She took her tray, a reinforced polymer slab loaded with dense, gray nutrient blocks, and turned to face the room. Cole was sitting at a table near the starboard viewport, nursing a mug of something dark and steaming. He looked terrible. His skin was pale, a fine sheen of sweat coating his forehead. The toxic air from Deck 4 had caught up with him. He was coughing into the crook of his elbow, a wet, rattling sound. Sitting across from him was Marshall. Marshall was a heavily muscled cargo hauler with a shaved head and a permanent sneer. He was the one who had stripped the wrench on the primary coolant housing. Nadine walked over. The deck vibrated beneath her steps. She stopped at the end of their table. Marshall looked up, his jaw tightening. He slowly put his fork down. Cole glanced up over the rim of his mug, his eyes bloodshot. "Is this seat occupied?" Nadine asked. Her synthesized bass voice cut through the ambient noise of the mess hall like a physical weight. Cole offered a weak, lopsided smile. He nudged his tray aside to make room. "Take a load off, big guy. Just don't break the bench." Nadine stepped over the bench and sat. The reinforced steel creaked violently in protest, bowing a fraction of an inch under her sheer mass, but it held. She set her tray down. The table was narrow. Her broad, heavily plated shoulders took up the space of 2 crew members. Marshall leaned back, crossing his arms. He didn't look at Nadine. He looked at Cole. "You're running a fever, Cole," Marshall said, his voice laced with forced casualness. "Maybe you shouldn't be hanging out with the guard dog. Might catch some fleas." The air at the surrounding tables seemed to freeze. Forks stopped midair. Nadine's internal system surged. Her primary heart beat a rapid, aggressive rhythm against her sternum. The natural instinct of a hazard insulted by a weaker creature was immediate, brutal subjugation. Her mandibles flared open a fraction of an inch, revealing the serrated, crushing jaws beneath. Her thick fingers curled against the tabletop, the dull points of her claws digging into the polymer surface. She waited for the anger to take over. She waited for the red haze of the kill drive, but it didn't come. Instead, she looked at Marshall, really looked at him. She saw the way his pupils were dilated. She saw the rigid tension in his neck, the way his boot was perfectly angled to kick the table away and run. He wasn't insulting her because he felt superior. He was insulting her because he was terrified, and his fragile human ego needed to disguise that terror as contempt. It was pathetic. Nadine's mandibles clicked shut, tucking neatly flush against her jawline. She didn't growl. She didn't stand up. She simply reached out with one massive hand, picked up a block of dense gray nutrient paste, and snapped it in half with a sharp crack. She turned her pitch-black eyes entirely onto Marshall. She didn't blink. She just stared at him, holding the broken paste, letting the sheer, overwhelming reality of her physical presence press down on him. "I do not have fleas," Nadine stated flatly, her voice a low, vibrating rumble that rattled the silverware on Marshall's tray. "My exoskeleton secretes a mild neurotoxin that kills parasitic organisms on contact. Would you like a demonstration?" Marshall's face went completely white. He uncrossed his arms, his hands dropping flat onto the table. He swallowed hard. "No, I'm good." "Excellent," Nadine said. She placed the nutrient block in her mouth, her mandibles shifting briefly to crush it, and swallowed. Beside her, Cole let out a sudden, bark-like laugh that immediately turned into a hacking cough. He pounded his chest with a fist, his shoulders shaking. "God almighty, Nadine," he wheezed, wiping a tear from his bloodshot eye. "You're gonna give the man a heart attack." Marshall didn't say another word. He stood up, grabbed his tray, and practically sprinted toward the disposal chute. Nadine watched him go. She felt a strange, bubbling sensation in her upper thorax. It wasn't anger. It wasn't the cold emptiness she usually felt. It took her a moment to identify the physiological response. It was amusement. She turned to Cole. He was leaning heavily on the table, his breathing ragged, but he was grinning at her. "You did not defend me," Nadine noted, her tone inquisitive. "Didn't need to," Cole rasped, taking a sip of his hot drink. "You handled it. I just sit here and look pretty." Nadine looked at his bruised jaw, his bloodshot eyes, and his greasy coveralls. "You are functionally incorrect," she said. Cole laughed again, wincing as his ribs pulled. "Eat your concrete, Nadine. We've got a long shift tomorrow." She ate. She sat in the crowded, noisy, foul-smelling room, her massive elbows taking up too much space. And for the first time since she had boarded the Wayfarer, she didn't wish she was in the dark. At 0300 hours, ship time, the internal comms channel chirped in Nadine's audio receptors. She was in her quarters, a retrofitted cargo container near the engine block that was the only room large enough to accommodate her. She was standing in the center of the room, running a standard abrasive file over the edges of her lateral plating to clear away the dead chitin. She tapped the comms unit on the bulkhead. "Nadine." "Hey." The voice was thin, weak. "You awake, big guy?" Nadine dropped the file. It hit the floor grates with a heavy clatter. "Cole, your vocal modulation is severely degraded. Are you experiencing respiratory failure?" A wet, rattling cough came through the speaker. "Nah, just fever spiked. Medbay is locked down for inventory. Can't get the automated dispenser to give me the good stuff." "I am coming." She didn't wait for a reply. She hit the door release and stepped out into the dim, red-lit corridor. Her heavy boots ate up the distance to the crew deck in massive, ground-eating strides. Cole's quarters were 3 decks up. By the time she reached his door, her internal processors were running through every known human pathogen and treatment protocol. Humans were agonizingly fragile. A shift in internal temperature of just a few degrees could cause catastrophic organ failure. She overrode the door lock with a heavy punch to the mechanical release panel and stepped inside. The room was tiny, barely larger than a storage closet. It smelled intensely of sour sweat and old laundry. Cole was tangled in the thin synthetic sheets of his bunk. He was shivering violently, his teeth chattering so hard the sound filled the quiet room. His skin was flushed a dark, angry red. Nadine had to stoop to fit inside, her dorsal spine scraping against the low ceiling. She approached the bunk, her massive frame casting a terrifying shadow over him. "Cole." He opened his eyes. They were glazed, unfocused. He blinked rapidly, trying to clear his vision. "Hey, sorry to bother you. It's cold. The ambient temperature of this room is 72 degrees Fahrenheit, Nadine stated, her vocal synthesizer dipping into its lowest, most soothing register. You are experiencing a pyretic response to the atmospheric toxins. Whatever you say, Doc, he mumbled, curling tighter into a ball. Nadine stood there, paralyzed by a sudden, overwhelming sense of uselessness. If there was a bulkhead to tear down, she could do it. If there was heavy machinery crushing him, she could lift it. But this, a microscopic rebellion within his own frail bloodstream? She had no weapons against this. Her claws, her armor, her crushing strength meant absolutely nothing. She scanned the small shelf above his sink and found a plastic basin and a stack of rough industrial rags, moving with agonizing slowness, terrified of breaking something in the confined space. She filled the basin with cold water from the tap. She soaked a rag, wringing it out between two massive armored fingers. She turned back to the bunk. She knelt, her heavy knee joints whining in the quiet room. "I'm going to apply a thermal sink to your forehead," she announced formally, afraid of startling him. Cole just grunted, his eyes closed. Nadine leaned over, her hand hovered above his face. The contrast was absurd. Her hand was a weapon of war, wide as his entire chest, covered in jagged ash-gray plates. She extended one finger, pressing the cold, wet rag against his burning skin. Cole let out a long, shuddering sigh. The shivering eased, just a fraction. "Thanks," he whispered. Nadine held the rag in place. She felt the heat radiating off him, sinking into the cold chitin of her own skin. "You are poorly designed," she said softly into the quiet dark. "Your cooling systems are inefficient. Your skeletal structure is insufficient to support your own mass under heavy gravity. You require constant maintenance." Cole gave a weak, breathless chuckle. He didn't open his eyes. Slowly, blindly, he reached a trembling hand out from under the blankets. He didn't reach for the rag. He reached past it. His fingers found the edge of her armored forearm, right where he had held her in the scrubber alcove. His skin was blisteringly hot against her cold shell. He curled his fingers into the ridges of her plating and held on. "And yet," Cole breathed, his voice slurring slightly with exhaustion, "I managed to find the best mechanic on the ship to keep me running." Nadine froze. The hum of the ship's engines felt very far away. The only thing she could feel was the small, localized patch of heat where his hand held her arm. She was a hazard. She was engineered for battlefields that no longer existed, built to tear apart steel and bone. But kneeling here in the cramped, sour-smelling dark, acting as a cold compress for a sick, infuriatingly fragile human, she felt a profound shift in her internal programming. She wasn't hiding anymore. She wasn't an obsolete war machine waiting to rust. She carefully shifted her weight, making herself as comfortable as she could on the hard metal floor. She kept her finger pressed lightly against the rag on his forehead. "Rest," Nadine commanded, her deep voice vibrating gently through the floorboards. "I will monitor your core temperature. I will not leave." Cole's grip on her arm loosened as sleep dragged him under, but he didn't let go. Nadine remained perfectly still, a massive armored gargoyle keeping watch in the dark, finding a terrifying, beautiful purpose in the act of keeping one fragile thing alive. Cole's fever broke on the third day. The recovery was not graceful. He spent 48 hours sweating through his sheets, coughing up gray phlegm that tasted like battery acid, and cursing the entire engineering lineage of the Wayfarer. Nadine stayed. She sat on the cold deck plates of his cramped quarters, her massive knees pulled to her chest, operating as a localized thermal sink and an intimidating deterrent to anyone who thought about demanding Cole's return to the shift rotation. When the Wayfarer finally limped into the orbital docks of Outpost 9, the ship was practically running on fumes and stubbornness. Outpost 9 was a deep space refinery station, a sprawling, ugly mass of tethered asteroids and rusted habitation rings. It smelled of sulfur, unrefined plasma, and desperation. For the crew of the Wayfarer, it was paradise. It meant synthetic liquor, real gravity, and beds that didn't vibrate. Within an hour of docking, the ship was deserted. Nadine was in the portside airlock, running a diagnostic on the primary seal. She had no intention of disembarking. Outposts meant crowds. Crowds meant tight corridors, unpredictable organic movements, and the inevitable, exhausting cycle of stares, whispers, and fear. It was statistically safer and emotionally quieter to remain aboard. You missed a spot. Nadine turned her massive, elongated skull. Cole was leaning against the airlock frame. He looked worn thin. His coveralls hung loosely on his frame. His cheekbones were sharp, and the dark circles under his eyes looked like fresh bruises. But he was standing upright, and he was holding two heavy, magnetically sealed transit passes. "My diagnostic is comprehensive," Nadine stated, her mandibles clicking once in mild irritation. "I do not miss spots." "Not the door, big girl. Your social calendar." Cole tossed one of the transit passes. It clattered against her chest plate and dropped to the floor. "Put your heavy boots on. We're going ashore." Nadine looked down at the small piece of plastic on the floor grates, then back up at him. "That is a negative. I am scheduled to overhaul the secondary manifolds. I overrode the schedule. Chief signed off." Cole pushed off the doorframe and walked toward her. He kicked the transit pass closer to her boot. "I owe you a drink. I distinctly remember promising you one before I tried to inhale half a ton of burning plastic." "I do not consume ethanol," Nadine said. Her voice dropped, vibrating through her chest cavity. "It degrades my neural pathways. Furthermore, my presence on the station will cause disruptions. The local population is not accustomed to my species." Cole stopped 3 feet away. He crossed his arms. "Let 'em stare. What do you care? You're a walking tank. They're a bunch of soft-bellied asteroid miners." "They will be afraid." Nadine looked away, staring into the dark glass of the airlock viewport. She hated the sound of her own voice in that moment. It sounded small. It was a biologically absurd phenomenon for a creature of her mass to feel small. Cole let out a long, slow breath. He stepped closer, closing the distance completely. He didn't hesitate. He reached out and tapped his knuckles against the thick armor of her sternum. The metallic clink was sharp in the quiet airlock. "Nadine, look at me." She slowly rotated her head back. "You kept me alive," Cole said, his voice stripped of all sarcasm. It was the same heavy, grounded tone he had used in the red dark of the scrubber alcove. "You took a steam blast for me. You sat on a cold floor for 3 days holding a wet rag to my head. You are my crew, and my crew doesn't hide on an empty ship while the rest of us drink." He bent down, wincing slightly as his bruised ribs pulled, and picked up the transit pass. He held it out to her. "Let them be afraid of the armor," Cole said quietly. "I know what's underneath it." Nadine stared at the small piece of plastic in his pale, fragile hand. Her primary hearts beat a steady rhythmic thud against her ribs. The fear of the crowd, the anxiety of the stares, It was still there, buzzing like static in the back of her mind. But the static was drowned out by the undeniable, terrifying warmth of his absolute certainty. Slowly, she raised her hand. Her thick claws delicately pinched the transit pass from his fingers. "I require a beverage with a high iron content," she rumbled softly. Cole grinned, the lopsided smile reaching his bloodshot eyes. "I know a place that serves unfiltered machine oil. You'll love it." The Black Lung was exactly the kind of establishment you expected to find on the lowest tier of a refinery station. The air was a suffocating soup of cheap cigar smoke, evaporated alcohol, and the sharp bite of ozone from poorly shielded neon signs. The gravity plating was set a fraction too high, making every step feel heavy and deliberate. Cole walked through the crowded bar with the casual ease of a man who belonged in the dirt. Nadine walked behind him like a battleship escorting a tugboat. The reaction was immediate. As she ducked her head to clear the entrance, the ambient noise in the room died. The clinking of glasses stopped. Laughter choked off into tense silence. A group of rough-looking human miners at a table near the door physically shrank back, pulling their chairs closer to the wall. Nadine felt the familiar surge of adrenaline. Her mandibles twitched, eager to flare into a defensive posture. Her shoulders tightened. Function is beautiful. Resilience is beautiful. She heard Cole's voice in her memory. She looked down. Cole hadn't stopped walking. He wasn't looking at the terrified patrons. He was weaving through the tables, heading straight for a booth in the back corner. He expected her to follow. He trusted her to follow. Nadine forcibly relaxed her shoulders. She locked her mandibles flush against her jaw. She didn't shrink to make herself smaller. She walked with her full height, her heavy boots thudding against the metal floor in a steady, unhurried rhythm. She wasn't a monster hunting in the dark. She was a mechanic looking for a seat. They slid into the back booth. The reinforced polymer groaned under Nadine's weight, but held. A terrified server drone deposited a glass of amber liquid in front of Cole, and a rusted tin mug of heavy, mineral-rich, synthetic sludge in front of Nadine before scurrying away. Gradually, the noise in the bar returned. It was quieter than before, and plenty of eyes kept darting toward their corner, but the immediate panic had passed. "See?" Cole took a sip of his drink, wincing as the cheap alcohol burned his raw throat. "Nothing to worry about." "Their heart rates are still elevated," Nadine noted, her acoustic sensors picking up the rapid thumping from the surrounding tables. "They are assessing my threat level." "Let 'em assess," Cole muttered, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Means they won't try to pick my pocket." They sat in comfortable silence for a long time. The harsh, pulsing neon light from the sign outside the window bathed them in alternating flashes of sickly green and deep shadow. Nadine drank her sludge. It tasted like raw copper and ash. It was perfect. "Hey, scrapper!" The voice was loud, slurred, and intentionally aggressive. Nadine's head snapped up. A man was standing by their booth. He was massive for a human, heavily augmented with cheap, bulky cybernetic arms. His face was flushed with alcohol, and he was staring down at Cole with a belligerent sneer. He wore the insignia of an independent hauling guild that was known for violently monopolizing the local shipping lanes. "You're in my booth, rat," the augmented man growled, stepping closer, intentionally invading Cole's personal space. Cole didn't flinch. He slowly set his glass down. He looked exhausted. "Plenty of empty booths, pal. Pick one." "I want this one," the man said. He slammed a heavy metal-plated hand down on the table, right next to Cole's drink. "Move, before I use you to mop the floor." Nadine didn't think. She didn't calculate the physics of the confrontation. Her biological response bypassed her higher reasoning entirely. She stood up. It wasn't a fast movement. It was slow, deliberate, and utterly unstoppable. She rose from the booth, her full height uncoiling until her dorsal plates nearly scraped the ceiling. The green neon light caught the jagged, scorched edges of her armor. The scars from the steam vent, the plasma burns, the heavy, brutal architecture of her exoskeleton. She didn't growl. She didn't flare her mandibles. She simply stepped out of the booth and placed herself between Cole and the augmented man. The physical difference was staggering. The man was large for a human. Nadine was an apex predator designed to rip through armored bulkheads. She looked down at him. Her eyes were solid black voids, devoid of any readable emotion. "Your request is denied," Nadine stated. Her voice synthesizer was set to its lowest frequency. It didn't just project sound, it projected physical vibration. The liquid in Cole's glass rippled. The augmented man froze. The alcohol bravery evaporated instantly. He looked up at the sheer wall of ash-gray chitin looming over him. He looked at the massive clawed hand resting casually on the edge of the table. He swallowed, his throat making a loud, clicking sound in the sudden silence of the bar. The man stammered, taking a clumsy step backward. "I made a mistake. Wrong booth." He turned and practically ran toward the exit, pushing past the other patrons in his desperation to get away. Nadine stood there for a moment, the heavy hum of the station vibrating through her boots. She waited for the shame to hit. She waited for the isolating realization that she had just terrorized another living creature, reinforcing her status as a nightmare. It didn't come. She turned around. Cole was still sitting in the booth. He hadn't moved. He wasn't looking at the retreating man. He was looking up at her. He wasn't afraid. He was smiling. It was a small, tired, incredibly warm smile. "Show off," Cole murmured. Nadine felt a sudden, profound tightness in her chest. Not a biological misfire, not panic. It was a terrifying, fragile sense of belonging. She realized in that dingy, neon-lit bar that she didn't want to be soft. She didn't want to be human. She wanted to be exactly what she was. She was a hazard. She was armor. And she had something worth protecting. Nadine sat back down, the booth groaning in protest. She picked up her tin mug of copper sludge. "He was displaying poor spatial awareness," Nadine said, her voice a gentle, vibrating hum. "I was merely providing a structural correction." Cole laughed, a genuine chest-deep sound that made him cough. He reached across the table. His small, bare, scarred hand brushed against the thick, cold plating of her knuckles. He didn't pull away. He let his hand rest there, an anchor in the dark. "Drink your oil, Nadine," Cole said softly. "We've got a ship to fix tomorrow." Nadine looked at his hand on hers. She didn't pull away either. "Understood, engineer. Sometimes the most human thing we can do is look at a monster and see a protector." Cole didn't fix Nadine by making her softer. He fixed her by showing her that her strength had a purpose. If you felt the weight of that neon-lit bar and the warmth of that simple touch, smash that like button and hit subscribe so you never miss another deep dive HFY story. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that function and resilience are beautiful. What was your favorite moment of Nadine's realization? Sound off in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next transmission.